Thanks a lot. Earlier this morning, Delcia mentioned something that I think is really important. What the first focus should be when we as plaintiffs take in a case, and undoubtedly it's a first focus too of the defendant when the complaint hits the desk. First focus, blood lead level. Blood lead level. Well, without a blood lead level, and this is elementary, there simply wouldn't be lead paint litigation. In most instances. I'd like to start this afternoon by talking about two types of cases, whether by virtue of the type of legal theory of recovery that's posited, or the type of evidence that's presented, do not rely at all upon blood lead levels. And specifically, I am speaking of the public nuisance style of case that's received great attention in the last 2 years. There have been some spectacular verdicts, and there have been some spectacular high court decisions, specifically the Rhode Island decision, basically throwing the cases out in their entirety. The other type of case I'd like to talk about, and I'm going to be using two examples, one in West Virginia involving a smelting plant operated by DuPont, and one in New Jersey involving a Superfund waste site in which high levels of lead have been found and continue to be found, that sought medical monitoring or seeking medical monitoring. In the case of the West Virginia DuPont action, $380 million in recovery was generated at trial. That recovery is broken down along the lines of abatement cost, medical monitoring, and punitive damages. What is so significant about that verdict, and this was a class action verdict, is the fact that not a single blood lead level was introduced by the plaintiffs at all throughout the entirety of the trial. Not one. The entire recovery was predicated upon risk exposure modeling. I'm going to be talking about that type of risk exposure modeling, which was essentially, I'm going to use the term pioneered by the EPA back in the late 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. And that modeling, which is known as integrated, I'm going to get this right, exposure uptake biokinetic modeling, or IEUBK, has been adapted and adopted by plaintiffs' experts and other government agencies in predicting what the risk will be of lead exposure and elevated blood lead levels. Not just currently, but going into the future. And it is also possible to model the exposure and the elevated blood lead levels historically. That is commonly done by the CDC and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry in the context of Superfund sites. So this is a device which has gained a foothold in plaintiffs' litigation and is being used to generate recoveries by the plaintiff's bar. With respect to the Rhode Island public nuisance case, a jury verdict was reached, I believe, in 2006, and last spring the Supreme Court of Rhode Island essentially vacated the verdict, dismissed the case, and determined that there could not be a public nuisance cause of action against the manufacturers of lead paint pigment. Approximately $2 billion was sought by the state of Rhode Island for a program of abatement which would cleanse the depleted and old housing stock of lead paint. Let's go back for a moment to the IEUBK modeling. IEUBK modeling was developed to determine what the risk factor of elevated lead exposure would be for a juvenile population. As I mentioned, it's been expanded. It's been expanded to include adults, and it's been expanded to include other people who are outside of the original range of age that this program was designed to study. Essentially, what IEUBK looks at are things like environmental lead concentrations. Some of us may be familiar with what the federal values are for soil, actionable soil concentrations of lead. I believe it's 400 parts per million in a play area, 1,200 parts per million for any other area. Well, IEUBK looks at that type of information as one of its foundations. You could use, for example, attic dust in a neighborhood that was subject to toxic pollution from, we'll use the smelting example, a smelting plant, and use that as sort of a baseline factor to put into this model. It's age dependent because we know that people at different ages, especially children, their intake to their GI tract is age dependent, and that's going to fluctuate over time. Uptake changes over time as well. How does lead get into the blood? How much of it gets into the blood? And where does it deposit in our bodies, in children's bodies? Changes over time. Other variables are taken into account. Variability in environmental measurements, as well as the amount of soil contact and dust contact the studied population can be expected to have. Children are more likely to play in the dirt, so to speak. Children are more likely to play on floors. Maybe they're going to spend more time in the attic if the attic is a habitable space, and so on and so forth. So the EPA originally pioneered the IEUBK to sort of summarize long-term exposure to lead. What the model produces when it is completed is an estimate of the average blood lead level. And originally, as I mentioned, this was only looking at a young population, 6 months up to the age of 7 years or so. It was supposed to assist in abatement of contaminated areas, whether it be a complex of apartments or a Superfund site. The EPA typically does not go around, it may, but it's not part of its abatement process, testing the blood lead levels of children. Why? Well, that can be idiosyncratic information that's giving the EPA a snapshot in time of what this overall trend may be. Maybe it's abnormally high, maybe it's abnormally low. For that reason, this modeling has come under criticism by both the defense bar and the plaintiff's bar. Predictably, defendants will argue that the IEUBK overstates lead risk. Plaintiffs will say, well, it doesn't take into account every single spike of lead poisoning and doesn't look at the individual. But in the context of the cases we're discussing, some courts have held that that is simply not relevant.